Get this poor woman off the plane right now. She's contaminating the air in first class." The captain's voice thundered through the cabin. A few passengers burst out laughing. Others raised their phones, delighted to catch a scene of public humiliation. The woman in the faded sweater just tightened her grip on her old backpack, eyes steady, saying nothing. "Your place is the terminal, not the sky," the head flight attendant sneered, tearing her ticket in half. She was shoved down the stairway amid mocking laughter as the PA system droned, "Apologies for the inconvenience, the situation has been resolved." Hours later at Airline Air's headquarters, an emergency meeting erupted. When the doors opened, the same poor woman they had kicked off, the plane walked in now in a black tailored suit, a gleaming badge on her chest. Lysandra Vale, chairwoman, Vale Aero Holdings. Behind her, the screen lit up with the headline, "Vale Holdings reevaluates acquisition of Airline Air." Lysandra stood there on the tarmac, the cold metal of the stairway biting into her palm as she steadied herself. The laughter from the plane's open door still echoed sharp and jagged like glass under her feet. Her sweater, a soft gray thing she'd worn for years, hung loose on her frame. Her sneakers, scuffed and faded, squeaked against the pavement as she walked toward the terminal. She didn't look back. Not once. Her backpack, patched and fraying at the straps, bounced lightly against her shoulder. A man in a suit, some guy with a Rolex glinting, leaned out of the plane's window and called, "Better luck next time, sweetheart." The other passengers roared. Lysandra's fingers tightened around the strap, but her face stayed calm, her steps even. She'd been through worse. Way worse. Inside the terminal, Lysandra paused by a coffee kiosk, the barista's eyes flicking over her worn clothes with a quick, dismissive glance. A group of business travelers nearby, their briefcases polished to a shine, whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "Bet she's here to clean the place," one said, chuckling into his latte. Lysandra's jaw tightened, but she didn't turn. She handed the barista a crumpled bill, took her coffee, and moved to a corner table. As she sat, a child dropped a toy plane nearby, its plastic wings skittering across the floor. Lysandra picked it up her fingers, brushing the tiny model, and handed it back to the boy. His mother flustered, muttered a quick thanks, but her eyes lingered on Lysandra's faded sweater, her expression a mix of pity and disdain. Lysandra sipped her coffee, her gaze distant, the toy plane's shape lingering in her mind like a quiet promise. The terminal was a blur of noise and motion announcements, crackling, kids running, suitcases clattering. Lysandra found a bench near a window, set her bag down, and sat, her hands folded in her lap, steady as always. A woman nearby, juggling a coffee and a phone, glanced at her and muttered to her friend, "God, they let anyone in here now." Lysandra's eyes flicked up, catching the woman's gaze for a split second. The woman froze, then turned away, pretending to check her phone. Lysandra didn't say a word. She didn't need to. That look, calm, unflinching, said everything. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag, flipped it open, and jotted something down. Just a few words. Then she closed it, tucked it away, and stared out at the planes rolling by. Years ago, she'd sat in a different kind of airport. Smaller, dirtier. Her mom's old station wagon had broken down just outside, and Lysandra, barely a teenager, had waited on a cracked vinyl seat while her dad argued with a mechanic over the phone. The air smelled like burnt coffee and cheap air freshener. Her mom had leaned over, brushing a strand of hair from Lysandra's face, and said, "You don't need to be loud to be heard, baby. Just be steady." Lysandra had nodded, clutching a library book to her chest. That was before the money came, before the family name became a whisper in boardrooms, before she learned to hide who she was, not out of shame, but because it was the only way to see people's true colors. Back in the present, the terminal's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Lysandra's phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and saw a text from her assistant, Claire. "They're freaking out at HQ." "You good?" Lysandra typed back quick and simple, "I'm fine. Keep them waiting." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and stood slinging her backpack over one shoulder. The laughter from the plane was still fresh, but it didn't shake her. She'd planned this, booked the ticket under Claire's name, worn the old clothes, boarded the flight to see what Airline Air's staff would do when they thought no one important was watching. And they had shown her exactly what she needed to see. The humiliation on that plane had started slow like a spark catching dry grass. Lysandra had walked up the jetway, her boarding pass in hand, and stepped into the first-class cabin. The seats were wide leather, the kind that screamed money. A guy in a tailored blazer mid-40s with a smug grin and too much cologne looked her up and down and snorted. "Lost your way to economy, hun," he said, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. A woman across the aisle, dripping in gold jewelry and fake charm, chimed in, "Oh, let her stay." It's like a charity case field trip. The cabin rippled with chuckles. Lysandra didn't flinch. She slid her backpack under the seat and sat down, her movements deliberate, like she was placing each piece of herself exactly where it belonged. Then came Tanya Red, the head flight attendant. She was all sharp cheekbones and glossy lipstick, her uniform pressed to perfection. She stopped at Lysandra's seat, one hand on her hip, and tilted her head like she was inspecting a stain. "Ma'am, are you sure you didn't mix up your ticket with someone else's?" Her voice was syrupy, but the edge was there, cutting. Lysandra met her eyes, calm as a lake. "I'm sure," she said, her voice low, steady. Tanya's smile tightened. She leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound private, but loud enough for others to hear. "This is first class. We have standards. That bag of yours is practically falling apart." A guy 2 rows back laughed so hard he coughed on his drink. As Tanya hovered, a woman in a sleek red dress, her hair pulled into a tight chignon, leaned over from the next row. She was the kind of person who always had a glass of champagne in hand, her smile practiced and cruel. "Sweetie, this isn't a thrift store," she said, her voice loud enough to draw more eyes. "You're embarrassing yourself." The cabin's laughter grew sharper, phones tilting to catch Lysandra's reaction. Lysandra's fingers paused on her backpack zipper, her eyes lifting to meet the woman's. "Am I?" she asked, her voice so soft it barely carried. The woman blinked, thrown her champagne glass trembling slightly. Lysandra turned back to her bag, zipping it closed with a slow, deliberate pull, the sound cutting through the cabin's noise like a warning. Captain Elliot Crane was next. He strode out of the cockpit all swagger and pressed lapels, his aviator sunglasses tucked into his shirt, like he was auditioning for a movie. He didn't even look at Lysandra's ticket, just sized her up, her faded sweater, her plain sneakers, her bare face, and barked, "This isn't a soup kitchen. Get her out of here." The cabin erupted. Phones came out, cameras rolling. A woman with a designer scarf and a pinched face leaned forward, smirking. "This is what happens when you let riffraff in. Ruins the whole vibe." Another guy younger with a man bun and a Rolex started narrating his video. "Check this out. Poor girl thought she could sneak into first class." Classic. Lysandra's hands stayed folded in her lap. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. Just looked at Elliot, her eyes steady, and said, "You're making a choice right now." He blinked, thrown for a second, but then waved her off. "Get moving," he snapped. Tanya tore Lysandra's ticket in half the rip, loud in the suddenly quiet cabin. "Let's go," she said, pointing to the door. Lysandra stood slow and deliberate, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. The passengers were still laughing, some clapping like it was a show. She paused at the door, turning just enough to look at Tanya. "Thank you," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "I've seen enough." The words hung there heavy like a stone dropped in still water. Tanya's smirk faltered just for a second. Then Lysandra walked down the stairs, the laughter chasing her out into the cold. At Orion Air's headquarters, the air was thick with panic. Gavin Holt, the interim CEO, paced the conference room, his tie loose, his face red. He was a big guy, used to throwing his weight around his suits, always a little too tight to show off his gym hours. "This is a PR disaster," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. The room was packed, executives, PR reps, a couple of junior staff trying to blend into the walls. A screen showed the video, now viral, of Lysandra being escorted off the plane. 50 million views and climbing. Comments poured in, disgusting. Who do they think they are? Boycott Orion. Gavin pointed at the PR team. Get that video down. Now, pay whoever you have to. Elliot and Tanya sat at the far end of the table, both trying to look unbothered. Elliot leaned back, arms crossed, his jaw tight. "She didn't belong there," he said, like it was obvious. "You saw her? Looked like she hadn't showered in a week." Tanya nodded, picking at her manicured nails. "I was just following protocol." That backpack was a health hazard. A few execs nodded, eager to agree with anyone who sounded confident. But a junior staffer, a young guy with glasses and a nervous habit of tapping his pen, spoke up. "I heard Vale Holdings sent someone to test us, like a secret shopper thing. What if it was her?" The room went quiet. Gavin laughed, sharp and dismissive. "A CEO. In that outfit? Come on, kid. Before the meeting ended, a woman from the PR team, her glasses slipping down her nose, hesitated, then spoke up. Sir, there's a memo from Vail Holdings. It mentions an anonymous evaluation. She slid a tablet across the table, the screen glowing with an email. Customer experience audit in progress. Gavin's face froze, his fingers hovering over the tablet. He scanned the words, then shoved it back. This is nonsense, he said, but his voice cracked, betraying a flicker of doubt. Tanya glanced at Elliot, her eyes narrowing as if she sensed something shifting. The junior staffer's pen stopped tapping, his gaze fixed on the floor, like he knew something no one else did. Lysandra, meanwhile, was in a cab, her backpack on the seat beside her. The driver, an older guy with a thick Boston accent, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Rough day, huh? He said, nodding at her bag. She smiled just a little and said, You could say that. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Claire. They're scrambling. Email went out. You ready for tomorrow? Lysandra didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, watching the city blur by neon signs, people rushing a street vendor packing up for the night. She thought of her dad years ago, standing in their old kitchen telling her, people show you who they are when they think you're nobody. She typed back, ready. The next day, the boardroom at Airline Air was a different kind of tense. The executives were dressed to impress, ties knotted tight, smiles plastered on. They'd been told a strategic partner was coming to discuss the acquisition. Gavin stood at the head of the table, practicing his handshake, muttering about brand synergy. Tanya was there, her lipstick fresh, her smile a little too wide. Elliot slouched in his chair, sunglasses on the table like a prop. The door opened and Lysandra walked in. Black vest, simple but sharp. Hair pulled back, no jewelry, no makeup. Just her. The room froze. Tanya's smile dropped. Elliot's jaw tightened. Gavin's hand hovered midair, unsure whether to offer it. Lysandra didn't sit. She stood at the far end of the table, her backpack cleaned, but still old on the floor beside her. Good morning, she said, her voice calm like she was greeting a neighbor. I'm Lysandra Vail, chairwoman of Vail Aero Holdings. I believe you've met me before. She let that sit, her eyes moving from face to face. Tanya's hands gripped the edge of her chair. Elliot stared at the table. Gavin forced a laugh, stepping forward. Ms. Vail, what an honor. We had no idea. Please, let's talk. Lysandra tilted her head just enough to make him pause. I'm here to see if your airline deserves to exist under our name, she said. The words were soft, but they hit like a hammer. During a break in the meeting, Lysandra stepped into the hallway where a young janitor was mopping the floor. He was wiry, his uniform slightly too big, his hands calloused from years of work. He glanced up, saw her vest, and quickly looked away like he'd been trained to be invisible. Lysandra crouched down, picking up a stray paper he'd missed, and handed it to him. You missed one, she said, her voice gentle. He froze, then took it, his eyes wide. Thank you, ma'am, he mumbled, his accent thick, his shoulders hunched. Lysandra nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer, as if she saw something no one else did. Back in the boardroom, Tanya whispered to Elliot, She's playing nice now, huh? But her voice shook, betraying her bravado. The meeting dragged on all corporate jargon and nervous smiles. Gavin kept talking about brand alignment and customer experience initiatives. Lysandra listened, her face unreadable, her notebook open in front of her. She wrote nothing, just watched. At one point, Tanya leaned forward, her voice sugary. Ms. Vail, I deeply regret any misunderstanding on the flight. We're committed to inclusivity. Lysandra didn't blink. Inclusivity. She repeated, her tone flat. Is that what you call tearing a ticket in half? Tanya's face went red. The room stayed silent, the air heavy with the weight of what wasn't said. After the meeting, Lysandra walked to the window, looking out at the planes lined up on the tarmac. She remembered another moment years ago, sitting in her family's old hangar. Her dad had been tinkering with a small plane grease on his hands, a grin on his face. This is freedom, Lys, he had said, patting the wing. Doesn't matter who you are up there. The sky doesn't judge. She'd been 16, her hair in a messy braid, her dreams bigger than the world. That was before Vail Aero Holdings became a name people whispered, before she learned to walk into rooms and change them without saying a word. Back in the present, the video of her humiliation was still spreading. Despite Gavin's orders, it wouldn't die. Social media was a firestorm. Hashtags, memes, think pieces. Airline Air's classism exposed. Yet one headline screamed, another, who was the woman they kicked off? Lysandra didn't read them. She didn't need to. Claire forwarded her the numbers. Orion's stock was down 30% overnight. Investors were pulling out. Sponsors were backing away. At headquarters, Gavin was on the phone yelling at someone about damage control. Tanya posted a tearful apology video, her makeup still perfect. "I was just doing my job," she said, her voice breaking just enough to seem sincere. The comments tore her apart. In a quiet moment at the hotel, Lysandra stood by the window, a glass of water in her hand. A maid knocked, then entered pushing a cart piled with towels. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done this for decades. She glanced at Lysandra's backpack, then at her face and offered a small smile. "Long trip?" she asked, her voice warm but cautious. Lysandra nodded, setting her glass down. "Longer than most," she said, her tone soft. The maid paused, then said, "You look like you've got a story." Lysandra's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Maybe I do," she said, her eyes meeting the maid's, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Elliot tried a different angle. He showed up at Lysandra's hotel the next morning, all charm and apologies. "Mizu Vale," he said, standing in the lobby, his uniform crisp. "Let me make this right. Come tour our new fleet. You'll see we're top tier." Lysandra was on her way out, her backpack over one shoulder. She stopped, looked at him and said, "You had your chance to show me who you are." She walked past him, her sneakers quiet on the marble floor. He stood there, his smile frozen, his hands empty. Outside, Lysandra climbed into a waiting car, her phone buzzing with another update from Claire stocks still tanking. "You ready to pull the plug?" The press conference came 2 days later. Gavin stood at the podium, sweat beading on his forehead, his smile stretched thin. "We've addressed the incident," he said, his voice booming with false confidence. Orion Air is stronger than ever. The reporters weren't buying it. They fired questions sharp and relentless. Who was the woman? Why was she removed? Is this how you treat all your passengers? Gavin's answers were vague, rehearsed. Then Lysandra stood up, her presence quiet but undeniable. The room went still. She stepped to the podium, her movements slow, deliberate. "Vale Holdings will not be acquiring Orion Air," she said. Her voice was steady, no trace of anger. She nodded to Claire, who tapped a tablet. The screen behind her lit up with security footage, clear, unmistakable. Tanya tearing the ticket. Elliot barking orders. The passengers laughing. The room gasped. Lysandra didn't look at the screen. She looked at the crowd. "An airline that judges its passengers by their clothes doesn't deserve to fly under our name," she said. The words were simple, but they landed like a verdict. Reporters scrambled, typing furiously. Gavin's face went pale. Tanya in the back covered her mouth. Elliot stared at the floor. The footage looped, the laughter echoing through the speakers. Lysandra stepped away from the podium, her backpack slung over her shoulder. She didn't need to say more. The truth was doing the talking now. The fallout was swift. By evening, the headlines were everywhere. Orion Air acquisition canceled. Mystery woman revealed as Vale Holdings chairwoman. The stock plummeted another 20%. Investors bailed. Sponsors dropped. At headquarters, Gavin called another emergency meeting, his voice hoarse from shouting. "We can fix this," he kept saying, but no one believed him. Tanya was there, her eyes red, her hands shaking. "We didn't know," she said, like it was a defense. Elliot just sat there, his sunglasses forgotten on the table. A junior staffer, the same one who'd spoken up before, muttered, "You didn't care to know." No one argued with him. Lysandra was back in her hotel room, her notebook open on the desk. She wasn't writing, just sitting, staring out at the city lights. Her phone buzzed Claire again. "They're begging," now the text read. "Gavin's offering to resign." Lysandra didn't answer right away. She thought of her mom years ago, standing in their old kitchen, her hands rough from years of work. "Don't let them make you small, Lys," she'd said. "You're bigger than their words." Lysandra had nodded, her teenage self unsure, but listening. Now she typed back, "Let them come to me." The next morning, they did. Gavin, Tanya, and Elliot showed up at her hotel, their faces drawn, their confidence gone. Gavin went first, his voice low, almost pleading. "Ms. Vale will step down. All of us. Just give Orion a chance." Tanya was next, her eyes wet, her hands clutching Lysandra's arm. "I was just following rules. I didn't mean it." Elliot couldn't meet her eyes. "I'll take the blame," he mumbled. "All of it." Lysandra looked at them one by one, her face calm. She stepped back, freeing her arm from Tanya's grip. "When I was on that plane," she said, her voice soft but clear, "did any of you say, 'Stop'?" The question hung there unanswered. The silence was louder than any words. At a small diner across town, Lysandra met Claire for lunch, the two of them tucked into a corner booth. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a quick smile, set down their plates with a clatter. "You look like you're carrying the world," she said to Lysandra, her voice kind but blunt. Lysandra glanced up her fork, pausing midair. "Just a piece of it," she said, her tone light but her eyes heavy. The waitress nodded like she understood and left a small stack of napkins by Lysandra's plate, a quiet gesture of care. Claire watched, then leaned forward whispering, "They're falling apart without you even trying." Lysandra pushed her plate aside, her gaze drifting to the window where a plane cut across the sky, its trail fading into the clouds. A week later, Lysandra made her move. At a quiet press event, she stood in front of a smaller crowd. No cameras, no fanfare. Just a few reporters, some staff, and a handful of curious onlookers. "Vail Holdings has acquired Orion Air," she said, her voice steady. "Through an anonymous fund Skyline Capital, we now own 51%. The room buzzed, but she raised a hand silencing them. "This isn't about winning. It's about fixing what's broken." She announced new leadership people who had been overlooked, undervalued some of them, from the ground crew, others from the back offices. People who knew what it felt like to be invisible. Gavin was gone, his office empty by noon. Tanya and Elliot were suspended, their futures uncertain. The news hit hard. "A woman kicked off plane now, owns Airline." One headline read, "Another Vail Holdings secret takeover." Social media lit up the video, now paired with clips of Lysandra's press conference. The comments were different now. She showed them. "This is justice. About time someone stood up." But not everyone was cheering. A few voices, old shareholders, bitter execs, tried to spin it. "She's just vengeful," one blog post claimed. "No real leader would do this." Tanya, in a last-ditch interview, said real wealth doesn't need to prove a point. Elliot, quieter now, told the reporter she got what she wanted. But respect. That's earned, not bought. The words stung, but Lysandra didn't respond. She didn't need to. Months later, the first flight under the new Orion Air took off. Lysandra was on board, not in first class, but in economy, her backpack tucked under the seat. The plane was full students' families, people who had never flown before. The Flight for All program had launched, offering free tickets to those who couldn't afford them. The crew was different too. New faces, some familiar ones like a baggage handler who'd once been mocked for his accent, now training as a flight attendant. Tanya and Elliot were there too, reinstated but demoted, working the beverage cart. They didn't speak to her, but their eyes said enough. Regret, shame, maybe a flicker of something new. On that flight, a man in a worn jacket, his hands rough from years of manual labor, approached Lysandra as the plane began its descent. He was nervous, his words stumbling. "I saw you on the news," he said, his voice low. "What you did, it means something to people like me." Lysandra looked up, her hands still on her backpack. She nodded, her eyes steady but soft. "It's for all of us," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The man smiled, a small grateful thing, and returned to his seat, clutching a boarding pass like it was a treasure. The cabin hummed with a different kind of energy now, one that felt like hope. As the plane climbed, the cabin was quiet, the hum of the engine steady. A young girl across the aisle, clutching a worn stuffed bear, looked at Lysandra and smiled. Lysandra smiled back, her hands folded in her lap. The girl's mom leaned over, whispering, "Thank you for this." She's never flown before. Lysandra nodded, her throat tight. The passengers didn't know her name, didn't need to. But when the plane landed, they stood clapping, their applause soft but real. Lysandra stood too, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. She stepped off the plane, her sneakers quiet on the jetway. "You've been judged. You've been pushed aside. You've stood in rooms where no one saw you. And you kept going. You weren't wrong to stay quiet. You weren't alone in your strength. The sky doesn't judge it, just waits for you to rise. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.